almost every human behavior, form of human consumption has now been turned into a drug. Pleasure and pain work like opposite sides of a balance. When we experience pleasure, the way that our brains get us back to the level position is first by tipping to the side of pain and then going level. What happens as we become addicted is we are compulsively pursuing our drug in the total absence of joy. Now we need to get that drug as a matter of survival.
Your book, Dopamine Nation, explains why the relentless pursuit of pleasure leads to pain.
Right.
Which you're now giving us. It's because there's so much pleasure out there and it's so plentiful, potent, accessible, and novel that you can stuff yourself with it in 5 seconds. And then the remainder of the 24 hours, you're just overstuffing yourself with it effectively, right?
Well, I think the key to understanding how the pursuit of pleasure leads to pain is to understand that pleasure and pain work like opposite sides of a balance.
Right.
And one side is pleasure and one side is pain. And the overarching rule governing that balance is that it wants to remain level, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And the way that the brain restores a level balance after any deviation from neutrality is first by tipping an equal and opposite amount to the other side.
Yeah.
So when we experience pleasure, the way that our brains get us back to the level position is first by tipping to the side of pain and then going level. That is really, really important. What's happening biochemically is that with an intoxicant, we're getting a sudden spike in dopamine release, followed immediately on its heels by dopamine free fall, not just to baseline firing levels of dopamine, because dopamine is always firing at a baseline level, but actually below baseline to this dopamine deficit state, which is pain. It's discomfort, it's dis-ease.
That's withdrawal.
Anxiety. It's withdrawal.
Right. Yeah.
And what's happening in the world now is that we're experiencing subtle forms of withdrawal all the time outside of conscious awareness. The other really important piece of that is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar stimulus, that initial response to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, less dopamine released, but the after response to pain gets stronger and longer. So we end up getting kind of that pleasure-pain balance kind of stuck on the pain side, where we're in kind of a chronic dopamine deficit state. We've essentially reset our hedonic set point as a way to compensate for too much dopamine coming in. So that's really the key piece there. It's not just, that the world is oversaturated with these drugs in all these various forms. It's that the way that our brains adapt to that is actually downregulating our own dopamine transmission and production to this dopamine deficit state below baseline level, which is very similar to depression, anxiety,
So if I were gonna physicalize this, and then I'm gonna try to bring it back to my entrepreneurial asceticism. If I were gonna physicalize this into like a keep it simple, stupid metaphor, tell me if this would be apt. So if you eat every meal at Golden Corral buffet, and by the way, it's free. You have lifetime free coupon. Oh. You go to Golden Corral and you stuff yourself. So it feels good. You stuff yourself. That's high on pleasure. And then you're going to go sit there and feel like crap and want to throw up. That's the pain equilibrium. And you keep doing that cycle over and over, like you're going up, down, like a yo-yo. But so that's like the shortest term, but also over time, you're going to kind of get sick of Golden Corral. So so the pleasure highs are going to get less and less over time, but the lows are still going to feel just as crappy every time. And maybe even more so, because eventually you'll start to feel sick just thinking of Golden Corral, but now you have to keep eating it because you're hooked.
Right.
Plus there's the actual long-term deterioration of the fact that you're just becoming diabetic, becoming obese, becoming hypertensive, becoming sick, and dramatically shortening your lifespan. So there's like the super short-term high-low cycle. There's the short-term tapering of the highs as they get less high. And then there's the long-term just degradation over time. Like, would that be a valid metaphor?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think the key.
I love brain chemistry, but I think sometimes it loses people.
Yeah.
Or at least it loses someone, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the key piece here is that what happens in the addicted brain is that the individual is in a chronic dopamine deficit state, meaning that now they need their drug not to get high, but just to feel normal. And when they're not using their drug, they're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. The reason this is really important is because what happens as we become addicted is we are compulsively pursuing our drug in the total absence of joy. So what looks from the outside like that person has no willpower and is so selfish, why can't they just stop, is in that person's brain nothing like that at all, because the physiologic drive to restore homeostasis or a level balance is so overwhelming that most of us would go outside of our moral compass in order to do it, which means that once we're an addicted brain, our drug just looms so large in our lives because we're in withdrawal, right? We've got a pleasure pain balance tilted to the side of pain. Now we need to get that drug as a matter of survival, or at least that's what it feels like in a way. We cannot not reach for it in order to restore that level balance or restore homeostasis.
So it just occurs to me, and admittedly, so much of what I think I know about what it's like to deal with addicts comes from watching the show Intervention. So I'm just going to throw that out there. But the way most people approach an addict is they tolerate it, but they're upset about it all the time. When in reality, it actually ought to be the inverse. It ought to be don't tolerate it, but have a huge amount of empathy for what they're going through.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I just throw that out there for the codependence of the world.
Yes.
But how'd you get into this stuff? How'd you become Dr. Anna Lembke that we all know?
Well, gosh,
was that a big enough question to start with?
That's pretty big. My life has been a sort of a meandering course. I certainly didn't set out to treat people struggling with addiction. That was never my life goal. I sort of made my way to medical school, wasn't really sure what I was going to do. Eventually landed on psychiatry because I was very interested in relationships through time and quality over quantity of our life experience. Found that I really loved it, but had no interest or skills in treating people with addiction. So initially wanted to avoid that population, but then began to realize that almost all of my patients were struggling with some sort of drug or what we call process or behavioral addiction. And that in my not asking patients about that, I was actually doing them harm. So about 20 years ago, started to shift my practice toward focusing on those types of behaviors. And over time, found it to be an incredibly rewarding population to treat. Patients with addiction who get into recovery are really remarkable people. I consider them to be modern day prophets for the rest of us living in this dopamine economy. And also when they get better, not only are their lives vastly improved, but also the lives of the people around them. So it's really, really rewarding work. And so that's kind of the short version.
Interesting. So as you were talking, and I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to ever check out my show before, but as a heads up, it's kind of neurotic. We just like bounce all around, and
that's fine.
You can maybe you can treat me at the end for my neurosis. But so a question comes to mind. I'm going to ask it while you were talking. I was sitting there. You were talking about the addiction population that were addicted to substances, were addicted to behaviors, were addicted to processes. Yeah. And my question is, unscientifically, which maybe you're not even allowed to be unscientific.
No, I'm happy to do that.
Good. Then unscientifically, American population, I think it's around 330 million, maybe 300 if we're older than 5 and younger than 90 or something. Mm-hmm. How many of us are addicted to something?
Good question. If you look at lifetime prevalence of addiction to a substance, it's about 10 to 20% of the U.S. population. That means
that's substances like drugs or alcohol, basically. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Would food be a substance?
Food is typically not in that category. So we're talking about the typical substances, stimulants, alcohol, cannabis.
So what if, obviously, if we broaden it, right? Food,
right.
porn, gambling, shopping. I read a book I'm sure you're familiar with, The Realm of Hungry Ghosts, I think is what it's called.
Yes.
Where he talks about his addiction to buying CDs.
Right. Yeah. So we don't have good numbers on that. We really don't, especially with the rise in addictive behaviors to digital content, which has really just exploded in the last 10 to 20 years, but is very hard to capture. So, for example, if you think about something like addiction to social media, the best data for that is probably in the Facebook files, and they're not going to be super eager to share that. So these are hard numbers to capture because, of course, the line between adaptive and healthy use and maladaptive and addictive and harmful use is also difficult to draw, right? There's no blood test or brain scan for addiction. We really base it on what we call phenomenology, which are patterns of behavior that are very characteristic for the given mental disorder that can be identified across populations, geographic regions, time periods.
So, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So hence, and I assumed there wouldn't be good data, and that's kind of why I couched it as unscientific. But I'm curious then, to your point about definitions, like, especially in the modern world where we are addicted to, like you say, processes, behaviors, stimuli, even means of communication itself can become that which we can be addicted to. It's not like, 200 years ago, people weren't addicted to having conversations. Right. But now, in a sense, they can be. Yes. Right. So given that it's a blurred line now, how do you actually define addiction?
Yeah, great question. So broadly speaking, addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or a behavior despite harm to self and or others.
So harm is a condition of addiction.
Yeah, broadly speaking, that's kind of the bedrock of the disorder. When we look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there are 11 criteria that are captured in this disorder that we call, a substance use disorder or a process disorder, or an addiction. Addiction is a more commonly understood term, although the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, doesn't actually use that term. But I use that term addiction synonymous with substance use disorders.
Okay.
And there are 11 criteria. And the more criteria that you meet, then the more addicted you are. So typically you have to have a minimum of 2 criteria to meet the threshold for addiction. And, it goes up from there to give you a mild, moderate, or severe kind of diagnosis. So as you can see, it's very subjective and feels very, unsatisfying and not scientific in that sense. And yet that's exactly how we diagnose every psychiatric disorder. So there's no brain scan or blood test for any psychiatric disorder. The brain is still very much a black box. We understand a lot more than we did 100 years ago, but still, when we make a psychiatric diagnosis, we are basing it on that person's behaviors, what we observe in them, what the people around them observe, and what they subjectively endorse. So the criteria from the DSM for an addiction can broadly be summarized as the 4 C's: controls, compulsions, cravings, and consequences. Out of control use is planning to use a certain amount and using way more than that. Compulsive use is a lot of mental real estate occupied with thinking about using, hiding use, and also a level of automaticity related to the use. Cravings is intrusive thoughts about using that come unbidden, as well as the physiologic urges to use that are very powerful. And then finally, consequences are related to all of the various life consequences that can occur when people become addicted. So those are sort of a summary of the 11 criteria. There are some physiologic criteria, things like withdrawal is one of the criteria, and also tolerance. Tolerance means needing more of a substance over time to get the same effect.
Man, this is so interesting. As you were talking, I realized about 3 seconds into the 4 C's, I need to be taking notes. what was the second C? I got controls, compulsions, consequences. I think I missed the second one.
Cravings. Cravings. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Because I'm so just a little bit of context, and I have a question. So I have pretty strong love-hate relationship with social media.
Yeah.
Where I actually view it as, for the most part, I view the consumption of social media as at best just a waste of time. And at worst, degrees below that, sinking fast. And but in my business, I have to be a producer of social media.
Right.
I have to be call it a dealer, a supplier, so to speak. And so my goal is to deal the best drugs possible, right? Like I know there's this world of people that are just almost wantonly consuming this stuff. And I'm trying to slip like a granola bar into the crack supply, right? Mm-hmm. Something that's nurturing. Anyway, but I have vacillated at times of like, I'm going on a blackout. I'm 90 days, no social media. I'm going to go walk around in the woods and be a human that can hold a thought for more than 12 seconds. But that's not an option for me. But anyway, so I have this like built-in tension around the whole subject. But so I just wanted you and the audience already has that context. They know how I feel if they listen to the show. But so I want to ask you, what would you say is what does a minimally dopamine addicted person look like? Assuming social media, let's just use social media as kind of the drug of choice. For somebody that's minimally addicted to dopamine stimulation that probably doesn't even think of themselves in those terms, how would you describe that behaviorally and sort of practically?
I think the way to think about this is, and this is also the way that I kind of think about it with my patients, in the room, is to think about that substance or that behavior that you have a conflicted relationship with. And actually, you've characterized that exactly in terms of your love-hate relationship with social media. So a behavior that you're drawn to, that you will kind of do as almost a default mode network, where you will just, it's sort of the thing that you do when you're tired, when you're stressed, to have fun, to escape. And importantly, that you find that you are unhappy with the way you consume that substance or behavior, either because you use too much or you use too often, or it's interfering with your goals or interfering with your values. People you love and care about are commenting that you're often distracted or checked out or otherwise impaired because of that behavior. So I think if we stop and really ask ourselves, then many of us can identify at least one thing in our lives that we don't necessarily want to stop entirely, but that we want to use differently. The other thing that I think is a subtle sign of worry, but I find it to be very helpful to think about, is that substance or that behavior that we're lying about. And it might be just a matter of degree. Like it's not that we're lying about consuming it, but we're lying about how much, how often, in what circumstances, exactly what the substance was, which is why one of the things I talk about in my book is the importance of radical honesty, where we're really intentionally focused on telling the truth, not just about our consumption, but really all of our behaviors, as a way to keep ourselves accountable so that we don't get lost in this realm of what we call in the addiction business denial, where we're actually ultimately then lying to ourselves. And one of the ways to do that, to be radically honest and really be more aware about our consumption, is to focus on it, right? And really look at it and really document it. Because the truth is that when we're chasing dopamine, it's very easy to lose track, and that most of us will greatly minimize our consumption of that substance or behavior that's potentially addictive and that we have that conflicted relationship with. And just to give you a very recent example in my own life, my daughter came up to me about a month ago and said, "Mom, you're always watching YouTube now." And obviously, as somebody who's very vigilant about these sorts of things and think that I'm doing a pretty good job, I got very defensive. I said, "I'm not always watching YouTube." She goes, "Yeah, you are. Almost every time I come up to you now and you're on your computer, you're watching YouTube." I said, "I'm not watching YouTube." And then I proceeded to justify what I was watching, which was some kind of sporting event related to my daughter's athletics. But when she walked away from me, I just took an extra moment and I thought, is she right? Am I watching a lot of YouTube? Let me stop and think about it. And a good way to do this is something called the timeline fallback method, where instead of thinking in a vague way about what we've been consuming, we actually take it a day at a time, going backwards from the current day. So you say to yourself, okay, I've been on YouTube for half an hour today, right after my daughter walked away. Well, how much YouTube did I watch yesterday? Well, I came home from work. I probably turned it on about 6 p.m. and I probably watched about 2 hours. Okay, so that was 2 hours yesterday, the day before that. And you keep going like that until you've figured out how much you've consumed in a week. And that can often be revelatory, because then it's like, oh, I've watched 20 hours of YouTube this week. So what felt to me like a half an hour here and a half an hour there turned out to be, like almost a day of YouTube, right? And then when I was willing to look at that and really see it, I was then motivated to change that behavior. Now, that's not always going to be the case. People who are severely addicted can see their consumption, be really motivated to change, and still not be able to change without help. But for someone like me who's a little bit addicted to a lot of different things, just that exercise allowed me to say, okay, I'm going to make the commitment to do a fast, or what I call a dopamine fast, which is one of the major early interventions that I recommend, where I'm not going to watch YouTube for a month. And I'm on like week 3 or so, maybe week 4 of that. I'm not tracking that too closely. But that's a really useful intervention, because it's also an opportunity to see just how addicted we've become, right? Like, just how hard is it to give up that particular website or that particular form of social media or what have you?
Well, first of all, you're useless to me now because I can't reach you with my YouTube ads. Seriously though, I think you just illuminated something that at least I'm going to say it out loud and see if it sounds as good out loud as it does in my head, or as impactful. But it's almost like the correlation between addiction and, call it, low self-esteem, disenfranchisement, feelings of hopelessness. And let me explain what I mean is, when you were talking about this timeline regression, timeline fallback method, which I like, it occurs to me, time itself is harm based on the extent to which you believe that there's an opportunity cost being paid of something better you could do at the time. So if you're like, man, in the last week, I've spent 20 hours on YouTube. For some people, if they're in a let's call it a lower place in their life psychologically, they're like, well, so what? What else am I going to do with 20 hours? But if you're like, let's say like me, where I'm like, oh my gosh, 20 hours, I could be mastering certain skills. I could be growing my business. I could be generating more income. I could be spending more quality time with my family. I have like all these wonderful positive things I could do with 20 hours. Then that analysis is going to like piss me off, probably into change. But that's the correlation. It's like, if you don't actually think there's anything better to do with your time, setting aside the physical aspects, or even maybe even the emotional aspects of addiction, if you just, as a calculation, don't think there's anything better to do with your time, then who the hell cares if you're spending all this time on this kind of, whatever addictable thing. But for you, that's probably super irritating to go, oh my gosh, I gave all this time to this thing, and here it is, your daughter. You're like, I could have been spending time with her, right? And so it makes me, to me, it illustrates the correlation between some of the kind of softer, more of the psychology, not so much the psychiatry of like self-worth and self-esteem and self-actualization, and even socioeconomic opportunity. Like, there are a lot, even if your addiction isn't, quote, destroying your life, it still could be destroying the life that you could have if you were using that time to do better things.
So this is a great discussion, and I want to tease it apart a little bit, because I absolutely agree with you that, alternative healthy sources of dopamine are very important when we're trying to overcome our addiction, right? Okay. So, having, people in our social network that we want to spend time with, having purposeful and meaningful work that we want to do, having people who need us and want us to be present for them. Those are all wonderful antidotes to the problem of addiction. However, it's really important to understand that there's something that very, very insidious that happens to motivation as we become addicted that is not necessarily tied to the other cost opportunities that we have in our lives. And let me see if I can explain that a little bit. So there is this sort of notion, which I think is a false notion, which is, if you have like all this great stuff in your life, and I'm not just talking material stuff, but I'm talking the great stuff of life that comes for free, but it's hard to find, then you would never get addicted. And that is not true. And it's especially not true in the world that we live in today, where everything has become drugified and is made more accessible, more abundant, more potent, more novel, more reinforcing releases, more dopamine. And what happens in the brain as we get into this cycle of compulsive overconsumption, we actually change our brains and decrease our motivation to engage in these other activities. One of the most common things I'll hear from patients who try the dopamine fast and get away from their drug for a month, and the reason I recommend a month is for people who are, especially people who are more severely addicted, a month is about a minimum amount of time it takes to reset reward pathways and reset dopamine thresholds. And that's really important and to be able to get access to other more modest natural rewards. But one of the most common themes I'll hear for people who actually make it is, I am so much more motivated than I was before, and I'm getting so much more done than I was before. And as a result of that, I'm feeling so much better about myself. So my point being is you've sort of made a certain proposition, which I think is partially true, which is if you have a flourishing life and self-esteem and all these other, psychological benefits, then you are less likely to get addicted. Or if you start to go down that road, it's easier to come out of it. But what I'm trying to communicate is that even when you have all of those things, we can very easily go down this road. And then these things diminish, they become less relevant, they recede, they're in the rearview mirror, and we lose our perspective on them and we lose our motivation to engage in those activities. I don't know if that made sense, but I think.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It did. It did. And it's powerful. And it's why people that seemingly have so much to live for throw their whole lives away over addictions, I guess. Right.
That's right.
So you define some of those other things, the enjoyable company of people, meaningful work in the world. And you differentiated between relationships with people and also the ability to help or impact people is kind of separate. And you labeled those alternative healthy sources of dopamine. Is it actually dopamine that those things do, or so it's the same neurotransmitter? And in which case, what is the difference? Is it just a smaller dose, or is it that it's not coupled with a physical sensation? Like, why is it that a dopamine from a Instagram is different than dopamine from feeding the homeless?
Great. Okay. So we are wired over millions of years of evolution to approach pleasure and avoid pain. And we do that reflexively without thinking. And it's what's allowed us to survive and thrive in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which is the world that we have lived in for almost all of human existence, say for the last 200 to 500 years. So the way that our brain gets us to approach the kinds of rewards that will keep us alive, what we call natural rewards, food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate, is by releasing a little bit of dopamine in a specific circuit in the brain called the reward pathway. And by the way, dopamine is the final common pathway from many other neurotransmitters and hormones, things like our own endogenous opioids that we make in our brain, not from ingesting our own endogenous cannabinoids. We make our own cannabis, right? Our own serotonin, norepinephrine, oxytocin. It's all a big soup in there. But the final common sort of ka-ching is the dopamine that gets released in that very specific reward pathway. And that tells us, ooh, that was a good thing. You need to do that again and again and again. But when we're living in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, we have to work very, very hard and wait a long time and get lucky to find that reward. Now you take that ancient circuitry, right, that is perfectly adapted to this world of scarcity. You're on this, you're on the desert, you've walked for 20 kilometers, you're hungry, you're thirsty, you're alone. You see an oasis, you see another person like bing, 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 bing. Yeah, it's awesome. But you take that circuitry and you transplant it to the modern day, where at, the tip of a finger, we have instant access with no a priori work or effort needed to be put into that.
No pain.
No pain, no pain. And not only that, the amount of dopamine that is released with modern drugs is enormous. It's like a fire hose.
And when you say modern drugs, are you only speaking about pharmaceuticals, or are you speaking about all these drugified things in our society?
Social media, video games, Twitter, online gambling, online pornography, and hookup sites. Food in the modern world full of processed starches, sugars, salt. It's all of it. I mean, almost every human behavior, form of human consumption has now been turned into a drug. So that means, what are those 4 features that make it different from, what our brain is actually adapted for? It's more plentiful, right? We don't run out of TikTok, right? You might even run out of cocaine, but you're not going to run out of TikTok, right? It's more potent, right? So where we used to have to get our opioids from the opium poppy. So we had to cultivate a plot of land. We had to wait for it to grow. We had to tend to it every day. We had to harvest it. Then we got a little bit of sap that we could smoke. And that was, it had its utility. Now you've got fentanyl made cheaply in a laboratory without any opium poppy precursors, sold on the street, for pennies to the dollar. So you've got more potent forms. And by the way, the digital content is also incredibly potent, right? It goes right to the visual cortex, these moving images, these flashing lights, the enumeration, right? Where we're rankings, we're very susceptible to numbers, and we want to get our numbers closest to whatever the top is. So you've got increased quantity, you've got increased potency, you've got increased access. Think about the smartphone and how that changed our lives. Now, running for the bus, you can be watching a movie, right? Totally different. And then finally, you've got increased novelty. And dopamine is very sensitive to novelty. That is to say, our brains naturally engage that treasure-seeking function where we're looking for the reward, right? And if we find a reward that's as good, but a little bit different from the last one, that's even more reinforcing. Because, we are wired for newness. We're wired for innovation. We're Mother Nature's ultimate drivers. And that's what you have with these digital products. The AI learns us, knows what we likes, proffers something that's similar to what we've done before, but a little bit different. That's why people get addicted to the news. I have lots of people now coming in saying, I'm addicted to the news. Even though the news is horrible and people think it makes me feel terrible, they can't stop engaging because of the newness feature and the way in which novelty is something that we're wired to approach.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The news is like, you're guaranteed to get the same thing in a slightly different package every day.
That's right.
That's so great. Man, it's like, as you're explaining this, it is so easy to see the world more clearly as you're describing these aspects of it. I mean, everything, you said it, everything today has become drugified, and you just explained exactly how. So powerful. And I have so many thoughts and kind of swirling questions. Would it be safe to say then that evolutionarily, biologically, that dopamine in some sense is how the brain evolved to get us to do the hard things that we need to do to stay alive and to, let's say, procreate? It's like, why would you walk 30 miles through the desert instead of just saying, this sucks, life sucks, I don't want to do this, I'm just going to sit here and die? And it's because at the end of this trek, there's some little fix that's going to feel good. And maybe there'll be a woman there you can make a baby with or something, right? It it pulls you through the muck, right? Yeah. But now there's no muck.
Right. Yeah.
That's, man. Yes. I mean, is that a decent summary of like what's gone awry here?
Yeah. I mean, it's really at the end of the day a mismatch between our primitive wiring, which has us be the ultimate strivers, working very, very hard to survive, to get that little hit of dopamine, which feels so good that we're willing to, do more to find it again. And then the world that we have essentially created, which is this world of overwhelming overabundance and the kind of drugification and dopamine hits everywhere we turn. We can't escape it even when we can escape it when we really try, but we don't even realize the extent to which from our, the first hit of our smartphone and our, caffeinated beverage and our bread with sugar in it to, the things that we more obviously identify as drugs, the cocaine that we use midday, the cannabis that we take to go to sleep, et cetera, et cetera.
So then I feel like, I don't want to assume, but I also am feeling this really joyous momentum toward all this theory sort of supporting my premise of the world or of life, is that, like, especially in the modern world, there's a value in intentionally choosing to live a life that is superficially harder than it might otherwise need to be, choose delayed gratification, even when it's not thrust upon you, to choose what some might, and I'll just give you, I'm going to just say what I'm thinking. Like, I put out all this content that's like, look, I'm on a mission to help people unlock their potential. And there's these amazing tools in the world. There's these amazing opportunities, whether it's online business, whether it's real estate, whether it's learning how to recalibrate your communication at home with your wife or your husband or your kids. We kind of know, all the knowledge exists now to have virtually any quality of life that you want. It's the discipline to implement it, and to the point of exclusion of most of the other things that we're tempted to have in our life. That's what's missing in the world is people that are willing, good. I say good is the enemy of great. Like, there's a lot of good things around that if you want to have the space to have a great life, you're going to have to get really good at saying no to, and then fill your life with a few disciplines and habits that move you toward the best possible life you can visualize yourself having, and then some, because it's actually achievable in the world if you'll change your habits. But to make all that work, I like to hold myself up as a credible example. I've sort of taken it upon myself to say, I'm going to be the guinea pig that proves. And so I'm going to get up really early, even though I don't have to. I'm going to work harder than anybody, even though I don't have a boss. I'm going to stay in really much better than needed shape just to prove that these habits, you can be in your 40s and still in really good shape. And it's sort of a service to my audience of I'm just going to go out and try to prove these things. But the biggest point of resistance that I get is I get a lot of feedback of people like, man, this guy's so uptight. It's okay to have a drink. It's okay to chill out. Like, this guy probably has no friends. This guy probably has no life. This guy's no fun to be around. And it's like, no, I actually think I'm pretty fun. And I definitely have a great family and a lot of great relationships, but I'm just trying to prove something that we as a world have gotten way too lackadaisical, because in the modern world, just living a healthy neurological balance actually makes you look like an extremist. Like you're some kind of, Amish person by choice. And it's like, no, that's just what it takes to actually feel good over time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I basically agree with you, and neuroscience would support that. So, we talked about this pleasure-pain balance and how with repeated pressing on the pleasure side, we eventually end up chronically tilted to the pain side. I like to imagine that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it there. So they stay on, and with repeated exposures, you get enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. But what's very important to realize,
now the seesaw is just stuck at that.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Because the gremlins are camped out there. With enough abstinence from that drug of choice, the gremlins eventually hop off and homeostasis is restored. But what's also true is that the gremlins will happily hop on the pleasure side of the balance if we intentionally do things that are hard, either physically hard, emotionally hard, psychologically hard.
You just made my life make sense. Thank you. Woo.
But there's a caveat there. So let me finish. Okay. So for example, exercise is the most obvious example. It turns out exercise is actually toxic to cells. And when we press on the pain side of the balance with exercise, essentially what we're doing is we're triggering the body to say, oh, there's an injury here. It's time to upregulate our own healing and feel good hormones and neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. And that's represented by the gremlins then hopping on the pleasure side of the balance to ultimately bring it level again. In other words, we're paying for our dopamine upfront, right? By doing things that are hard, we activate the body's own re-regulating mechanisms to make dopamine to respond to that. And it's actually, there's a whole science called hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. And what we're
that's like cold, intentional cold exposure and like shocks to the system.
Ice cold water baths, exercise in its myriad forms.
Some people eat really spicy food because it helps their metabolism.
Spicy food, exactly. Intermittent fasting from food, many other mind-body practices, exposure therapy, a creative and intellectually challenging endeavors. These are all things where we invest our labor and our intention, and it's hard. It's hard to do.
I love that you said you're paying now instead of paying later.
That's right.
Okay.
And if you think about it from a graphic point of view, if you imagine dopamine firing is represented on the graph as a line. With an intoxicant, what you get is a sudden spike of dopamine above baseline levels, followed by dopamine free fall below baseline into this dopamine deficit state. But what you get with hormesis, or intentionally inviting pain into your life, a kind of intentional asceticism, is you get, for example, with exercise, the data show a gradual rise in dopamine in the latter half of exercise, followed by elevated dopamine levels that remain elevated for hours afterwards before going back down to baseline. So you never have to do that dopamine deficit state because you paid for your dopamine up front. Now, here's the big caveat, and this is really important, especially for someone like you and also for your listeners. If you press on the pain side of the balance too hard and too fast, you essentially turn that painful endeavor into an intoxicant. If you think of, for example, people who cut on themselves, what happens is they immediately get a huge release of endogenous opioids that basically kind of breaks the system, so that subsequent cuts have to be much deeper, but very quickly they reach a threshold where the body just can't respond. It's overloaded. So now you've essentially taken something that's healthy and adaptive, which is doing things that are hard or doing things that are painful, and you've turned it into something that's unhealthy because you pressed too hard and too fast on the pain side of the balance. And where this comes in, again, for potentially for you and your listeners, but also for all of us in the modern age, is the problem of workaholism, right? Where we're now constantly pressing on the pain side of the balance. Our to-do list becomes our drug, and we're not able to let it go. It becomes our major defense mechanism, our major strategy. Or worse yet, we're pressing hard on the pain side of the balance, but instead of letting our bodies physiologically respond by naturally tilting to the side of pleasure, what we're doing is, at the end of a hard working day, we're going out and getting drunk. So we're going pain, pleasure, pain, pleasure. And that kind of tweaking is very, very hard on our system. It literally releases stress or our own endogenous adrenaline or stress hormone. So that's not good either. What we're looking for is, if you're going to use intoxicants, use them rarely and intermittently. Leave enough time in between for the gremlins to hop off the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. And don't use really potent intoxicants. And likewise with pain, depending upon your fitness level and where you are, don't go out and run a marathon if you've never run before.
Mm-hmm. So this is so good. We have a few minutes left. So if we could kind of try our best to distill, for the person, and I get, not everybody's all created equal, right? Some people will never like Jeff Lerner's podcast, and I'm fine with that. Yeah. But for those of us that kind of are within this belief set that the world is this place of opportunity, and most of the rewards of this world are going to go to the people that are kind of willing to go above and beyond and do a little more than the average. I don't want to be too elitist, but it's most of the great things in this world are reserved for the people that are willing to do what most people aren't willing to do. That's just even being a psychiatry professor at Stanford is reserved for people that are willing to push themselves in that field way harder than most people just, that are pre-med college majors, right?
Right. Well, let me interject here, because I don't like to think about it as a ladder of achievement, because I think that can be its own drug, and I'm not sure a healthy one either. One of the important things that you said is that part of what gets you going and getting up early in the morning is you're enduring pain also in the service of hopefully helping other people. And we can
Right.
endure a lot more pain when we're doing it in the service of a greater meaning, purpose, or a moral value. So I don't think that this what I'm talking about is not necessarily about getting up some achievement ladder. It can just be something like even living in accordance with your own values. Is effortful. It's hard to do the right thing, and it can come up in small ways throughout a day. So I just wanted to throw that.
I actually love that. I really appreciate that softening context you just applied to what I'm saying, because it's actually it is very true to what I believe and what I'm hoping to inspire in people. None of this has any purpose if it's not on mission for your life, and the impact you can have in this world, and that I believe we were all created to have in this world, But I guess I'm trying to kind of find that for the people listening that are like, yeah, I want to make a better life and I'm willing to make some sacrifices and have the discipline to make it happen. Like, what is the optimum calibration of pain, pleasure, in terms of intensity, in terms of timing, in terms of pacing? Like, how would you sort of visualize how hard to push, how much to rest? I don't know. Maybe it's an impractical or impossible question, but like I always want to do better. So how can I do better for a guy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for someone like you, who probably gets his dopamine primarily by pressing on the pain side of the balance, the big task for you is going to be mindful of getting addicted to pain, and a kind of a workaholism, and using that as your primary defense against tolerating the uncertainty or sort of the existential questions that come up. And so for you, my prescription would probably be something like, could you go for 24 hours and not do any work, not check social media, not make any progress on your to-do list, not do anything about your YouTube channel, and really just force yourself to just maybe even sit and do nothing, and probably feel pretty uncomfortable because you will be in withdrawal, right? You will probably experience anxiety, irritability. Maybe you'll get some questions like, "Oh, this is stupid. Why am I doing this?" But right. I think that probably would be a good place for someone like you to start.
So we, in terms of my view of the world, I've organized pretty much all functions in physical, personal, and professional categories. So I have this basic belief that literally as much as possible, which may be a problem. We may need to talk about that. But like as much as possible, I want every minute of every day to be definable, identifiable, and intentional around this is what I'm working on right now. And work can be right now, I am deepening my personal relationship with my kids. Great. It can be right now, I am improving my health and long-term wellness. It could be right now, I am increasing my net worth to have more, legacy for my children. It can be, so like, it's not my workaholism spreads across my entire life, not just my career, is maybe what I'm saying. So would you say in that experiment, 24 hours, like even playing with your kids needs to be put on pause for those 24 hours because that fits into my work. So
yeah, no, of course. But I guess, so we're almost out of time and this gets into a whole other area, but I guess what I would wonder for you is it does sound like you're trying to control every moment. And maybe even I would be curious in your interactions with your kids, is it also on your terms? Is it your agenda? Is it like, okay, dad's here now, so this is the time to deepen our relationships? In other words, is there a way in which you can be present in your life where it's not part of your self-growth agenda?
Okay. I know we're out of time. So like you said, we've opened up a whole other door here. Man, this is so almost to leave on that cliffhanger is like actually pretty wonderful in a way.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to give me the answer.
No, because you're going to have to do the experiment. And maybe you've even gotten some feedback from people who care about you in your life that what they maybe would like to see is, do you let go a little bit? Let go.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. Okay. I know we literally only have 1 minute left. I'm declaring to the universe, I'm going to figure out how to get you back on this show for a part 2. This has been so great. Thank you for the work that you do in this world, by the way, Dr. Lembke. Like you talk about things that I think there are a lot of people that would just rather the world not talk about, like leave it unsaid so that we can all be controlled. And thank you for what you do.
Oh, well, it's really my great honor, that people let me into their lives as well as you today. So thank you for, being willing to be vulnerable. That's very cool.
Of course. No. And I did actually try to look you up on social media, and I didn't find anything. I assume that may be by design.
That's right. I'm not on social media. I never have been. And I don't really have a phone either. I have one for emergencies. It's kind of turned off in my bag, but I know myself too well. I wouldn't be able to moderate it. So I'm going for abstinence on that one.
So if the world wants to come know more about you or get access to your books, where would you direct them?
I think, reading Dopamine Nation, you can learn a lot about me just from reading that book.
And that's at AnnaLembke.com.
Yes.
You do have a website.
Yes, I do have a website. Yes.
Okay. And I'll make sure that link appears wherever this appears as well.
If you loved that episode, then you're definitely going to love this one. Check it out.
You're doing ridiculous stuff because you're human. Your experience is completely legitimate. You see, we all feel that about ourselves, that there's something wrong with us. So it makes it entirely normal to know that you're not normal.